Katherine is the founding curator of $2.5 million Curt Teich Postcard Archives at the Lake County Forest Preserve in Chicago, or was anyway, and still is involved in that. Um, Huge collection, and some of us anyway, have had the opportunity to see her before, but she was kind enough to agree to come see us out here on the West Coast, which is wonderful. At the time in 2016, collection was turned over to the Newberry Library in Chicago, which is where it's housed today. Katherine received her bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Nebraska. After after that, she went on to attend St. Andrews University in Scotland, studying art and music history, and then she came back to the United States and got her Master of uh, Art and Music History from the University of Chicago. So she is very well versed in what we all love. So with that, I turn the whole thing over to you, Katherine, and thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you so much. So I do, as Felix was saying when we were sort of chit-chatting before the meeting began, I do know a few people who are with us this evening from points far flung around the United States because the universe of people who love postcards is kind of a small family in a way. Dealers, collectors, and then curators and historians such as myself have kind of converged our interests over the years, and some of us know each other. I mean, I don't think Hal Ottaway, I'm not sure Hal and I have met, maybe once at a postcard show 20 years ago, but very well-known name. And so I'm just honored to be with all of you tonight, actually. I normally speak through the auspices of the Illinois Humanities Council. I'm what's called a Rhodes Scholar, which is just that clever play on Rhodes Scholar, indicating this group of individuals you see on the screen here, all of whom have some specialty that relates to the history of the state of Illinois. And that's how Sjpc came upon my presentation. I was actually speaking as an Illinois Humanities Council Rhodes Scholar on the subject of picture postcards to a historical society in the north suburbs of Chicago. I don't know how Sjpc found out about it, but he did and attended, and then contacted me afterwards and asked if I would be willing to present to you guys. I was thrilled to do that because mostly I present to general audiences in public libraries, local and regional historical societies, and other similar sort of general settings. So my audiences tend to know, I wouldn't say nothing about postcards, because I would venture to guess that everyone, really literally everyone, knows something about postcards. It's just such a iconic communication device in our culture. But most of them don't know anything about the history of postcards. They're just interested in history in general. And so the presentation I'm going to give you tonight is partly that, and then partly I've augmented it with a little bit more information about Curt Teich himself, because I thought maybe this group would be more interested in that. And then at the end, I didn't know that I would have people from all over the country, but at the end I've pulled up some postcards from California just to sort of bring all the ideas that I'm going to present to you together at the end with some local interest. So without further ado, I will start with this, which is actually not a postcard, as those of you who are familiar with so familiar like Hal with postcards. It's a little bit thin top to bottom and a little bit wide side to side. It's just not quite that 3.5 by 5.5 size or 4 by 6 size. And indeed, this is from the 1860s, and it's a precursor to postcards. It's a illustrated envelope. It's obviously of the nation's capital in the US Capitol building. sent in the 1860s, both illustrated envelopes as well as illustrated letterhead came on the scene after color lithography had become perfected in a way to make it inexpensive to provide color images of places, well, of anything really, but of places, to a burgeoning tourist market in the late middle 19th century. These are not unlike postcards in that they would generally be purchased when someone was visiting an area such as the nation's capital, and generally used to send kind of a form of tourism communication back home or to someone at a distance from where the person is. So this is an example of an envelope, and here is an example from 1861. You can actually see the date of illustrated letterhead where the image of the south coast of England in the tourist town of Bournemouth fully takes up half of the sheet of writing paper. And I present this one in particular because of what the writer says. My dear George, I've been waiting to write to you for a long time. I've waited till I could get a sheet of paper with a pretty picture on it. And so little did this correspondent know how important that simple remark was about what she was intending to do. Her intent was not to just write a note, but rather to tie her experience of being in a vacation or in a holiday setting like this with correspondence to someone with a picture. And I'll comment about that a little bit more as I go forward with my remarks. And right at the end, I just want to note at the bottom of this note, it says, there's a little X like on a treasure map, and it says our house. And if you look up on the bluff, right in the middle distance where it's lighter there, you can see that same treasure mark or treasure map X, and that must be where her holiday cottage is, which is just kind of a sweet aside about this particular piece of ephemera. So that's 1860, 1861, the 1860s. And indeed, 1860 was an important time for postcards as we begin to understand them today. In the German-speaking territories, specifically in Austria in 1869, were first produced these correspondence cards, which very quickly were, that word correspondence card was reduced to postcard, K-A-R-T-E, pretty promptly after these were introduced in the North German states. So these are widely understood to be the first postcard, if you will, but they were issued by the post office, and they did not have a picture on them. Many of them have pictures or writing on them, such as this example here, where you see the front and back of one of these, an early postal, not a correspondence card, but an American postal, where in this case, the person who sent this Dr. Pierce, would have bought the postal from the US Post Office, affixed with this, the 1 cent postage needed to send it, and a blank space for the indication of the address. And then everything that's on the back, whether it's an image or some text, as in this case, would have been applied to this postal by the person, in this case, this Dr. Pierce. Sometimes these have pictures, usually of products for sale. Quite often I've noticed in my experience that the products are from kind of itinerant medical people, kind of like this. This Dr. Pierce is hawking his common sense medical advisor. The ones that have pictures on them are for liniments of different kinds and ointments and elixirs and those sorts of things. But important to note that these are not postcards in the way that we think of them, or I don't mean we who are here tonight, but rather the general populace think of postcards as having a picture on them and a place for the address and a place for the message. So really the first picture postcards so described, with that image, place for a message, place for the stamp, place for the address, were those published in 1889 for the Paris exposition in that year. And of course, the main event or the main site of the Paris exposition was the completion of the Eiffel Tower, as it still is today. Such an amazing structure that if any of us were to go to Paris today, we wouldn't go to Paris and not see the Eiffel Tower, and indeed probably ascend the Eiffel Tower. It's just such a wonderful experience and thing to do. But in 1889, it was even more so, because at that time, the Eiffel Tower was the tallest human-made structure on the face of the earth. So ascending up this structure and at the top finding yourself with a post office and this new phenomenon of a postcard with a picture of the Eiffel Tower on it at the top that you could send to someone, time stamping the experience of going as far as you could off the face of the earth was really something. So these 1889 postcards were printed by the French newspaper Le Figaro, and they are widely regarded as the first picture postcards as we understand them today. What you're looking at on the screen, though, is actually not one of the Le Figaro postcards. It's from a couple of years after that. And it is what most of you here tonight, and I'm going to be kind of, quick aside, I'm going to be kind of tempering some of my remarks this evening with, because I know that this particular audience, not being a general audience, you know a lot of this postcard history, but still, it's good to see it all in one place, I think. But this postcard was printed a couple of years later, and you can see that that big space to the right-hand side of the card was intended for the message, because in those days, between 1889 and in this country, 1907, the only thing that you were allowed to write on the picture, on the, pardon me, the stamp side of the postcard was the address, and then affix the stamp. This example you see here is also a French example, and you can see in the French, right below carte postale, it says, "Ce côté est exclusivement réservé à l'adresse." So this side is exclusively reserved for the address. And that's a caution to the corresponding public that they're not to put any kind of message on the sort of business side of a postcard in these days. You can see also, by the way, down in the lower left-hand corner, that this particular example was published for the exposition of 1900, so just 11 years after those first postals. Consequently, people really went to town on using this blank space on the picture side of postcards for their message. The example you see here, which is a Swiss example, reduces the image of the part of Bern, Switzerland, to quite a small area so that the correspondent could really use it as a form of communication. And sometimes we see examples where we have Victorian cross writing, where you write one way and then you turn your stationery or your postcard 90 degrees and write the other way, so that you get double the writing space on these postcards. So now we've traveled from 1869 to 1889 and going into the 1890s. The Germans were really still the principal publishers of these fine postcards. Even the majority of American postcard businesses at the time ordered much of the postcard stock that they offered for sale in the United States, was printed in Germany and then shipped to the United States. And then American postcard companies almost acted as a middleman in a way, distributing them in this country, but they were printed by and large in Germany. And let me go back and show you this. You can see some of these early examples that I showed you where there's one image. This became this Gruß aus, which is really in German just greetings from, or design of these early postals, still pre-1907. So the correspondent had to reserve their message just for the image side of the postcard. Became a very popular design for the early picture postcards. I show you one from the German town of Heidelberg, but there are many American examples too that use this same sort of setting. There's a smaller, increasingly small space used for the message, and then a general image of the town, and then these inset images, not unlike later the large letter cards, and I'll show you some examples of those. It's really the same idea. It's just that the aesthetic is different because they were produced at a different time in a different time period. And so that brings us to the United States. And the reason I go on the road and speak to Illinois audiences about something to do with Illinois history is represented by what you see on your screen now. This is one of the 12 postals produced by Charles W. Goldsmith for the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. So these were published in Chicago. Goldsmith got special dispensation to do what the Europeans had been doing for a while now, before 1893, and published this series of 12 postals with these beautiful, beautiful views of the Columbian Exposition. And these are regarded as the first American picture postcards, making Chicago specifically, and also Illinois, the state of Illinois, sort of the birthplace of the American picture postcard. And that brings us to this man. This is Curt Otto Teich. He was the founder of the Curt Teich Company of Chicago. You see him here, though, when he was 19 years old. And this is the year that he came to the United States. He was born in 1877 in Greiz in Germany. And then pretty soon after his birth, his family moved to Lobenstein. I'll show you a map of modern Germany so that you can place that and understand where it is. And a map that was produced right before the 20th century, rather, of Lobenstein. And a view here of what it looked like at the time that Curt Teich came from as an immigrant from Germany to the United States. So this is what it would have looked like. And this is a postcard of Lobenstein. Here he is again, a couple of years later. And let me tell you just briefly his story, that his father, Christian Teich, came for the World's Columbian Exposition, as people did from around the globe, to take in the exposition and see this city of Chicago, which was of some renown by that time. Christian Teich, Curt's father, spent some time in the city of Chicago. He stayed here a couple of months. And when he went back to Germany, he told his children, he had 7 children, and he told several of them that they should go to Chicago and seek their fortune because there was a lot of opportunity there. The city was bustling, businesses were growing. You just needed to go and see if you could figure out what it was that you wanted to do. And in fact, one of his other sons, Max Teich, came to Chicago hot on the heels of Christian Teich and became a hotelier, and eventually bought the Kaiserhof Hotel in Chicago and was a very successful hotelier. Curt Teich was a little bit younger than Max, and so he followed about a couple of years after the 1893 exposition. And he, somewhat supported by his father and his brother, started a small printing business. This is actually the Curt Teich Company at Irving Park and Ravenswood on the north side of Chicago in its final location. It had 3 locations during the time Teich was growing his company, and this is the final one of those locations. But he started as a jobber printer. He printed anything that would come through the door. He printed German language newspapers, he printed flyers and broadsides and business cards, and anything that anyone would bring in, he would print. But he fairly soon after he started the business became intrigued with the idea of picture postcards. It was a new idea, hadn't been around for very long at all, just a couple of years. The country was growing, and he decided to see if he could make his fortune and build his printing company up as a specialty printer instead of a jobber printer. Before I show you a few of the postcards that he printed and explain a little bit more about that, I'll just show you a few interiors of the Teich company. This is the first offset press taken in, well, it actually says on the lower right-hand side there in 1910. The man you see on the left-hand side is not Curt Teich, he is a pressman. A pressman is today and was at that time an extremely important and well-regarded position. You can see just by the complication of this machine itself, which is a Heidelberg press, that the sort of machinery and the complication of it that a pressman would have had to understand in order to do the print jobs that they were undertaking. By 1910, Curt Teich was well and truly printing pretty much just postcards. And what you see loaded on the back of this press are the enormous sheets of paper. That's how postcards were printed, 32 designs up on large sheets of paper, run through the press, 32 designs up, and then cut after they were printed. So what you're seeing there is exactly how postcards were printed then and still are today, although probably more on roll stock rather than sheet stock. A couple of decades later, this is a picture of one of the press floors, and in the company's heyday in the 40s, late 30s, 40s, early 50s, the company had 30 presses of this size, each measuring 30 feet wide by 10 feet long and about 10 feet high. You can kind of see just getting the scale from the workers who are managing each one of these presses. And these machines had the capacity to print 2.5 million postcards every hour. That's what the print capacity was in the heyday of the Teich company. It's not to say that they did that every day, day in, day out, but it gives you a sense of the enormous capacity and output of this one company. And indeed, the Curt Teich company became the largest volume producer of view and advertising postcards in the world, and maintained that status for several decades in the middle part of the century. And it's because of that capacity. I brought one more view of the interior of the plant this evening. This is the art department. This is taken in the late 1920s. The Curt Teich company, again in its heyday by the late 20s, throughout the 30s, throughout the 40s and into the 50s, employed between 900 and 1,000 people in this plant in Chicago. It was a big operation and was one of the destinations for young men at that time, mostly coming out of art and design school in the city of Chicago, would seek to work for the Teich company retouching photographs. I have an example of a retouched photograph right at the end of my presentation this evening. So this man, here he is much later in life when he's a successful businessman. He isn't a pioneer of postcards. He's not the inventor of postcards, but he certainly is one of the key figures responsible for saturating the world with the postcards that we enjoy and collect today. Because what he was printing hot off the press, fresh, beautiful color, with crisp edges. He was printing hundreds of thousands of them every day and shipping them not only to all the states of the United States and all the provinces of Canada, but to many foreign countries as well, especially those that were tourist destinations for people living in North America. During the, and I have one more view. This is that same building today. It's still there, and it looks really very much like it did. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's condominiums today. So you can live in this place, and it's actually called Postcard Place. So I think we should all get a condo there, and we can have our club meetings there. But this is what it looks like today, and it's you're looking at it, kind of looking toward Lake Michigan, slightly south and east, standing right in the middle of Irving Park Road, if you're familiar with Chicago at all. So Curt Teich, not only was he an enormous volume printer of postcards, and the coverage of his clients, the people who would buy the postcards and distribute them was all over North America and eventually many foreign countries. But here's one of the reasons why he's to be celebrated, I think, today. And that is because he kept all of this in scrupulous order from the very beginning. The first postcard he ever printed, he numbered card 1. And then there's card 2 and card 3 and card 4. And as soon as he started offering different styles of cards, then he would branch out and have numbering systems for each one of the different cards, all card series or styles, all starting with whatever the series style number was, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is how he kept his company archives in that plant in Chicago. He kept 15 examples of every postcard he ever printed, and he kept much of the original photography and layout artwork that went into producing the postcards. Eventually, he became, I think, best known for these large letter cards. He was the largest designer and purveyor of these large letter cards. And that art department that we saw a view of a minute ago, those are the guys who would design these. And they're designed, if you've ever seen any of the art panels for these, in exactly how they look. The client, so let's say the 5 and Dime store in Puxatawny, PA wants to order some large letter postcards, then they have to send a black and white photograph of each one of those buildings or sites in the town to the Teich company plant. And those artists actually reduce the photographs, cut them to size with just a little a sharp blade, an X-Acto knife, and then create a new image like this. And then it's rephotographed as a complete image and then run on the press, and then color is applied to it on the press. So that's what those art department people are doing, that and also retouching images. And we'll look at some of those here in a minute. So that is kind of what they became most famous for, these large letter postcards, by the early 1930s, maybe the very late 1920s. But really their bread and butter, their stock in trade, was views of towns and cities. This one is Coopersville, Michigan. I chose it because it could be anywhere. It could be Libertyville, Illinois. It could be San Jose. It could be Iowa City. It really could be anywhere, except that we know that it's Coopersville, Michigan. So to those who are interested in Michigan or the Midwest, this has special meaning. But Teich sent salesmen all around the country to generate interest in taking photographic views of these towns and cities and printing them on postcards. The salesmen themselves were equipped with cameras, so they could take pictures up Main Street and down Main Street and the new Carnegie Library and the new bandstand in the park, or whatever it was that's important to a town or a city. The salesmen themselves would try and drum up business. In a sense, it was kind of like guerrilla documentation. They weren't thinking about documenting American towns and cities, but functionally, that's what they produced. And it was comprehensive. And it's one of the things that's very important about the postcard documentation of towns and cities in these early decades of the 20th century is that sometimes for rural locations, picture postcards are the only visual document we have of these common places. I use this card to illustrate this point. And it's, as you see, it's the interior of a savings bank in Pullman, Illinois, about 1910. It's a nice looking space, nothing unusual about it. It's got marble desks where you can, make out your deposit slip, and marble at the base of the teller's windows. But it could, here again, be anywhere in the United States. It's not, it's in Pullman, Illinois. And I would argue that in thousands and thousands of cases, having a picture postcard printed of these places, the photograph taken for that purpose, if that had not occurred, these spaces would not have been documented. And it's in their very unspecialness that makes the postcard form of visual documentation so special to us today. Because it wouldn't otherwise exist. So it could be something extremely extremely well photographed, like the Flatiron Building in New York City, something that's been photographed a million times, or it could be something just common and everyday, like this train station in Pennsylvania, or for that matter, this train station in California. I chose those two to look kind of similar in the roof line, the sort of arts and crafts movement styling of the architecture, to underscore this point of the everydayness of the documentation that postcards provide to us today. So here I'm going to take us on, and again, this is, I know I'm preaching to the choir this evening, and all of you do not have to be persuaded that everything in the 20th century found its way onto postcards, but nonetheless, I'll go through what I've prepared for a more general audience, and I think you'll find the images charming and revealing, even though you don't need to be persuaded that postcards are a wonderful historical source. This is one of my favorite postcards. It comes from the early days of auto tourism. It was after the golden age of postcards, but it was at a time when people were still buying them and sending them kind of like crazy. And as you all know, it was regarded as a craze in those days. This particular image I find aesthetically charming because it's in the early days of auto tourism in this country, where people had their own cars for the first time, cars were a novel, and had a little bit of leisure time, a little bit of money, and they could go to these modest places, tourist camps and tourist cabins. And this one I find especially charming because of its homeliness, the little window boxes with the plants, and the cutaway that shows the interior with the quilt on the bed and the potbelly stove, and everything about it sort of offers to the prospective auto tourist the comforts of home, but yet you're on the road. It's also very time pegged in the sense of its color. There's these soft colors that are part of the 1920s, early teens, 1920s. And then just to contrast that with just 2 decades later, this one's from 1939, one of my very favorite Curt Teich postcards, the Cool Motor gas station in Shreveport, Louisiana. And those two, both documents of the American road, are so, so different in color, in style, in presentation. Obviously, the change in the automobiles themselves underscores that, but nonetheless, this highly saturated, very Art Deco, streamlined Deco color is time pegged to the 1930s. Community events, this charming one from Longmont, Colorado, a pumpkin pie day illustrated on postcards. Sports, this is 1906 Chicago Cubs. Normally I talk to Illinois audiences, so in all fairness, I also show the 1906 Chicago White Sox, because I never know what my audiences are going to, what affiliations my audiences hold close in their hearts. And then this one, which is the first one that I've shown you that is not printed by a postcard publisher. This is a real photo postcard. I do have a series coming up here in a minute where I'll show a variety of real photo postcards. But as I think all of you know this evening, the early decades of the century, Azo and other companies provided photosensitized 3.5 by 5.5 paper so that anybody who had a camera and the wherewithal to develop photography could do so on postcard that was postcard paper, printed on one side with a stamp box and the area for the address, and on the other side with a blank for your image. This one is from Highland Park, Illinois. All that writing you see on it is definitely from the time period, and probably just an indication of the person who took this photograph and printed it. I just think it's wonderful, though. We all miss you. Come back for the game on Saturday, and that boo rah rah, which is that old, 1900 football cheer. But it isn't all, you know, tourism and getting on the road and playing sports and pumpkin pie day. They're also, I argue that everything in the 20th century found its way in some way onto a postcard at some point. I have a series of just a couple of images here, postcard images here, that have to do with the African American experience in the 20th century, starting with this. And this is a Curt Teich printed card. And when I first came upon this card, when I was early on, when I was working with the collection, I was unfamiliar with what Tell 'em We're Risin' meant. And so I'll quickly tell you the story. Tell 'em We're Risin' was a motivational rallying cry for African Americans coming out of Reconstruction after the Civil War. It was something that was said by the African American leader, Richard Robert Wright. He was born in 1855, so he was born just 5 years before the beginning of the Civil War. And after the war concluded, he lived down in the South in Atlanta, this young man. And in 1868, so 3 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, the Union General O.O. Howard came down to the South and traveled throughout the South, addressing assembled crowds, trying to make connections between the North and the South and aid in the function of Reconstruction and uniting the nation and healing the nation. So in 1868, he was in Atlanta. Now think about Richard Robert Wright. If he was born in 1855, he was just a 13-year-old young boy in 1868. And this Union general was addressing a crowd in Atlanta. Richard Robert Wright was in the crowd, just a young kid in the crowd. And the general called out, "What message should I bring from the South back up to the North?" And this young man yelled out, "Tell 'em we're risin'." And that stuck. And the newspapers got a hold of it. And it not only stuck because it was printed, but it also stuck to Richard Robert Wright. And it became later a rallying cry for African Americans who were working so hard to come up out of slavery and into a free society. So that whole story is told on the face of this one small 3.5 by 5.5 piece of card. Tell 'em we're risin', the young colored Americans' message to the world. It isn't just something as sort of positive as that. I did not this evening bring any of the extremely troubling, racist and stereotypical postcards that were printed in their hundreds of thousands, unfortunately, in the early parts of the century. But I show you two examples here that are of interest. This one is the colored men's dressing room at the National Malleable Castings Company in Indianapolis. This is about 1910. And it's interesting in that it comes from a series of postcards printed by this company. And you see some of them here. There's a series of, I think, 8 of these postcards. But the first one you saw was the colored men's dressing room. Then you see here the colored women's dressing room, and below it, the white men's dressing room. And then in the upper right hand, the regular employees' dining room, and in the lower right hand, the colored employees' lunchroom. So what's interesting about these is there doesn't appear to be any difference in the quality of the facilities, the size of the facilities, or even the decor. As you see, there's some sort of decoration in both of those dining room scenes, and it seems to be exactly the same. They are simply segregated. We don't know anything about why this company printed these cards. They didn't print anything but employee facilities in the series. They did not print any of the industrial workings of the castings company. But it provides to us an interesting example of segregated facilities at this time period. And then the last one I bring to you tonight is from 1923. This is also printed by the Curt Teich Company. And one thing I should, just a quick aside, the numbers that are written in that burning cross, that's just the card number. This is from the Curt Teich archives, the company archives. And so at some point, someone just used that to write the card number in pencil. So don't understand that those numbers don't have anything to do with the subject of the card. But this card was ordered by the KKK, and Teich Company printed it. And it is a kind of an example of, if we go back to this one, printed this one too, not, about 10 years before, and many others in keeping with these, as well as very stereotypical watermelon eating and picking nits out of the hair and other sorts of things that we would regard as anathema today. But this just short series, not series, but examples show that the Teich Company printed any postcards that they were asked to print. And that's an important thing about this particular industrial archives, because Teich saved examples of everything he printed, and he himself did not curate or edit what kinds of jobs came to the company. What has come down to us today is really the United States as it sort of saw itself, bit by bit, by job, how the nation saw itself expressed in these visual images. And it's unlike it's not a collection at all. It is just an archives, and it just happens that the stock and trade of this business is pictures of the world, or in this case, the country. So that was a little bit of an aside that took us into a more serious part of culture in the 20th century. But postcards also are evidence of the changes in fashion. This is a wonderful Alphonse mucha postcard. This is one of the first ones I've shown you that it's not printed by the Teich Company, by the way. Now I'm going to be kind of interspersing some that are Teich printed and some that are not. This one is a wonderful Alphonse mucha postcard for the French Champagne, Vintner, Moet et Chandon. It's actually a menu card printed as a postcard, but it's a wonderful Art Nouveau design. Printed at the very same time as this wonderful Wiener Werkstatt postcard printed in Vienna. These are almost almost the exact same year, but two very different aesthetics. A little bit further into the century, any interiors that show transportation, such as these train interiors, and then later airline interiors, show the fashions of the day. Not only the fashions people are wearing, but I use the term fashion in a broader sense to encompass all the aesthetics of the accoutrements of the spaces, as well as the colors and the style of, in the case on the right-hand side of the dishware. Everything is, again, it's just a document. It's a visual document of what our lives look like at different times in the century. A bit later on, this wonderful image from one of the casinos in Las Vegas. Ladies in a pool in Hinsdale, Illinois. And this card, printed by the Teich Company, is for the manufacturer of that, what we would refer to today as mid-century modern furniture. But like any advertising image that comes to us, comes down through time, the changes in the style are apparent in how the family setting itself, for one thing, that they're playing a board game, but everything about it, again, the coloration and the way it's set up, speaks to its time period. And this one from 1968. I think I'm just going to go back through that series one more time quickly, just to look at those colors from Art Nouveau to this sort of Viennese Wiener Werkstatt. A little bit later, the colors change again, soft pastels of the 50s. And then the harder, the sort of harder, shinier, if you will, colors of the late 60s. So going from something as colorful as that to something, to this introduces a little series of postcards this evening that are real photo postcards. Already talked about that. And again, I realize that the audience tonight knows a great deal about all of this, but still it provides a good sort of overview of the history of postcards and their importance. So one of the ways in which these real photo postcards were used was, or not used exactly, but leveraged, was to document happenings in communities in a way that the printed postcards didn't as much. They did some, but not as much. And a couple of examples are this of the collapse of a bridge near Scranton, Pennsylvania. This one is a tornado in the city of Omaha. This one is the destruction of liquor in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Independence, Kansas during Prohibition. Two wonderful parade views. There are countless examples of real photo postcards of parades. The lower one on the bottom is the children's parade on the 4th of July, I think is particularly charming. And just everyday life. This is a road building crew in rural Louisiana. This is one of my favorite real photo postcards because I'm drawn in by this man. He's a tailor, it looks like, and the look of where all of his wares are set up looks to be like a boarding house room. And all I can think of is, we don't know anything about this man. There's no marking on the card, but all I can think of is that he's working out of his boarding house, and he has all of the suits and the waistcoats and things that he can make for you. He's actually ironing. I don't know about the stuffed bird that's with him there, but I find it an excellent example of documentary evidence of these real photo postcards in the early decades of the century. And especially intriguing because I just feel that I know this man in some way from stories, and just, even though he's anonymous. Real photo postcards of street views are so different from the printed postcards, even the really beautifully printed postcards, in that all those artists you saw at the interior of the Teich Company, a lot of them were retouching details out or into the photographs of street scenes or anything. I mean, the interior of a restaurant, it could be anything, but street scenes especially. When I look at this real photo postcard of Chinatown, I look at it and I think all the ways that the Teich Company would have changed what you see here. They would have taken the markings, the crossing markings out of the street. There seems to be a wagon parked there. They would have taken that out. They might have even straightened up the awning on the left-hand side, put clouds in the sky. On the art files in the Teich Company archives, one of the very common notes that the salesman wrote down for the printers was put clouds in the sky. So I'm looking at the gentleman who's with us this evening, who was in Boise. I don't see your name on the side there, but you've got this great printed postcard behind you of what looks like a post office or something. But those clouds are not real clouds, obviously. Those clouds were put in by by one of those artists, one of those young men who worked for the Teich Company or for V.O. Hammond or for some other printing company. This is not unlike the road building crew, but it's like a gazillion pictures of the proprietor of the store and everybody standing outside the store, a little bit like earlier, everyone standing outside their sod house in rural South Dakota. This one came to my attention actually at the time I was speaking to the Highland Park Historical Society. It is a country club in Highland Park, Illinois, and it's just a view of the golf course. And I show it because, I mean, look at the ones we just looked at. They're so detailed and so fascinating, and you just want to just look in them and kind of take a magnifying glass so you can see all the detail. This one, not so much, But the reason it came to my attention, and the reason why I think it is a good example of the documentary power of postcards, is the archivist of this country club was preparing to attend my Zoom presentation. And he emailed in advance and said, "Say, we have wonderful postcards of the country club. Would you like to use any in your presentation?" And I said, "Well, sure, send me a few and, explain why they're of interest." And so he did. And this one, I'll show you a detail here. This is just a detail on the right-hand side. You see those long, dark look like moles, look like they have a big mole problem. They're actually what are called copses, COPSES, like a small grove of trees. But that is, I understood, I mean, I came to understand a Scottish term for this kind of a bunker, and the way it's kind of just sticks out at right angles to the fairway on a golf course. And this man was just saying, almost as a casual aside, he said, oh yes, the year after this photograph was taken, they completely changed the course design and they modernized it and took out all of these old-fashioned Scottish design bunkers. So simply because there's this view, postcard view of that, we have photographic evidence that probably, arguably, but probably would not have remained to us. And I just found it important, I guess, that you never know why a visual image that comes down to us, you don't know why it's important until you think about it a little bit more and put it into context. But the commonness of some of the postcard, especially real photo postcards, is evidenced in this particular example. And of course, on real photo postcards are all kinds of wild characters are pictured. It's one of my favorites is just a rattlesnake wrangler somewhere down in the Southwest. This fellow who's an itinerant preacher going around in his wagon trying to, spread the gospel. And these two characters, which mean a lot to me, actually. On the right-hand side, these are both real photo postcards, and on the right-hand side is my great-grandfather. And he sent this real photo postcard to my grandmother, his daughter. And on the back of this, so that's why I have it, but on the back of it, he wrote all the way across. He didn't send it as a postcard. It is a postcard, but he didn't send it as such. He wrote a message all the way across the back that said to his daughter, Jessie, that he bought, that a photographer came to town. He didn't call him an itinerant photographer, but we know that that's the case, that a photographer came to town and stayed for a week, and that my great-grandfather said that he went and had his portrait taken and that he bought 10 of them, 10 copies, and then he proceeded to list the 10 people to whom he sent the postcards. But in doing that, he expressed exactly what we all know anecdotally occurred, that photographers did. It was a way to make a living, is to kind of go around like the state of Iowa and go to towns and just stay there long enough for people and set up a tent and set up your dark room or inhabit a storefront for a week or two. And people of modest means could come in and have a formal portrait taken in a rural setting, such as someplace in Iowa. This particular one was taken in Indiana. And then on the left-hand side is his grandson, my father. And this was taken at Rockefeller Center in New York right before he shipped out to serve in the Philippines in World War II. So this is a different type of real photo postcard in that someone on Rockefeller Center had the concession to do exactly this. It's sort of like the paper moons down in Coney Island or Atlantic City. Someone had the photo concession and tried to sell real postcards, photo postcards to tourists as they were looking out down Manhattan Island toward the Empire State Building. So these are separated by a generation. There's a man in between them, this man's son and this man's father. But they both are good examples of real photo postcards. And to my general audiences, I always then encourage them to look at their own family photo archives, so to speak. And maybe there are photographs that you have always thought of as just photographs. Flip them over and see if there aren't the markings of postcards, because I think most people do have real photo postcard portraits in their family archives. And this one is an example of a real photo portrait postcard of someone who's not, a nobody like my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my father, but rather of Benito Mussolini. Now this inscription on the back of it is, looks like it's in a foreign language, but it's not, it's in English. So I'll quickly read it, you can follow along. It says, "This is a recent photograph of Mussolini, a strong face, but not the brutal one some caricatures make of it. When he was 9, Mussolini's mother taught him to read when he was 6. When he was 9, she insisted, notwithstanding his father's indifference, that he should be put into a boys' school. He had a few terms in a normal school at Bologna and a few in the university at Lausanne. He is a great student of history, political economy, and languages. Of these last, he speaks 4. And at 38, he is leading Europe, some say the world." So that's kind of it's written with a fountain pen, and it's a pretty chilling expression of, it was written in 1921, and it's a pretty chilling expression of, now that we know what happened and how from 1921 to the Second World War, Mussolini behaved and how he factored into the war. So we're going to leave real photo postcards for a minute and go back to Paris. And I'm just taking you back to Paris with this charming puppet show in the gardens at the Champs-Élysées, but it's only just to bring us back to Paris to make this point, that postcards have really changed. They've changed in some ways. They've changed in size and they've changed in format, and certainly they've changed in the number of people who use them, but people still do use them in exactly the same way as they did in 1889, in 1893, and this example from 1907, where the person says, "Yesterday it was a beautiful clear day in Paris and we had quite a good time in the afternoon. We went to the very top of La Tour Eiffel." And almost 90 years later it's the same experience, 1999. So from 1907 to 1999, and this person says, "I'm writing to you from the clouds. We're at the top of the Eiffel Tower looking at beautiful Paris." And so, especially to my general audiences, I use this to express how little postcards have changed since their inception. The famous postcard collector Leonard Lauder, about whom I'll speak in a minute, said that he calls them one of the most enduring forms of communication in the 20th century. And I think he's right about that. In fact, just a couple of months ago, my own son, who's only 25, so he's not a baby boomer. He's not a fully fledged adult or an old person. He's a young person. And he went to the Black Hills. And sure enough, while he was there, he sent me a postcard. And it wasn't because postcards mean so much to me. He just bought a postcard and sent it to me and said, "Hey, we're in the Black Hills and having a great time and wish you were here." And so this confluence of experience with message, with the function of sending it through the mail, and the sort of leap of faith that it's going to get where it's going, and an image that you yourself have chosen that expresses what's happening to you, has just not changed at all. And I find that charming, and I find that important. So just dipping a little bit back into sort of everything that appears on postcards is this wonderful image from 1964. This is actually printed by the Teich Company. He's still printing this kind of postcard in 1964. And 30 years later, in 1994, the Rolling Stones printed a postcard when they released their album Voodoo Lounge. Now, those two cards are the same thing, basically. It's the same thing. It's just promoting the band. Politics is widely covered on postcards up to the modern day. This is an English example that's encouraging the conservative vote. This is obviously an American example of the Dwight Eisenhower family, the cornerstone of America in the White House. Very, very similar, a couple of administrations further on, of Richard and Pat Nixon and their daughters. On the other side of the ticket is Adlai Stevenson, a son of Illinois. Back on the English side is this also a conservative, published by the Conservative Party, warning of the dangers of the Labor Party. And of course, this is Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister from 97 to 2007. And it's one of my favorite political postcards because its design is just, there's no missing what is going on here. There's something behind, there's evil behind that smiling face. It's just a very, very strong image. And then I prepare you that I have this very strong image that was printed in 2015. So think about that date. It's predates his election. I'll leave that for you to discuss in your own head, but so now I'm going to talk just quickly about collecting postcards. And I know I have a group of collectors here, dealers and collectors and lovers of postcards. You've seen many of these postcard albums that were so popular in the decades after the stereographs were in people's front rooms and in their parlors when people would come over and they would pull out the stereopticon so that they could see those card images. A little bit after that, people did the same thing with postcards, as you all well know. And this is just a typical example of a postcard album from those early years. Postcard exchanges even were, during the golden age of postcards, were something that was in certain towns. This one in Birmingham, Alabama. Obviously on the right-hand side, they were serving, I don't know, coffee or lemonade or something. So quite the social destination. But even just in any town, any stationery store, any drugstore or dime store would sell postcards. And this is a wonderful real photo postcard interior just of a stationery store, but you see those two great postcard racks on the left-hand side there, and the one that's shaped like the Ferris wheel rotates around like a Ferris wheel. That's quick aside that we were given one of those Ferris wheel postcard racks just a couple of years before we turned the Teich Archives over to the Newberry Library. And I know that they have restored it and they have it on display in their exhibition hall right now. So this is the man I mentioned a little bit ago. This is Leonard Lauder. Leonard Lauder is the son of Estee Lauder, who founded the Estee Lauder Cosmetic Company, which is now one of the largest cosmetic and beauty companies in the world. She really founded it, just sort of pulled up by her bootstraps and started putting cream on people's faces in department stores to get people to try her ingredient or her recipes. But the business was very successful, and by the time her children were born, they did begin to have money. And later in life, this man, Leonard Lauder, he's in his early 70s now, he had significant money and was able to collect fine art. And you see him pictured with a Picasso Cubist painting, one of about 20 that he gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art a couple of years ago. A collection worth over $1 billion at that time. But Mr. Lauder started by collecting postcards. His family would go down to the Miami Beach area in the wintertime when he was a young boy. And he was, the wintertime in the 1930s and 40s in Miami would have been postcards everywhere you stepped. Every hotel would have postcards, every restaurant, every bar, every place you looked, there would be postcards down there. And he was intrigued by them. I think he always was interested in art and design. And so he began to collect them, and he still has all of the cards that he collected, even from the time he was a little boy. Now he collects much higher end cards. He, you recognize this Wiener Werkstatt lady that you saw earlier on the right-hand side. But on the left-hand side is another Wiener Werkstatt designed by the artist Josef Hoffmann from 1910. And it's actually an Easter card. if you look at it carefully, you see that those shapes are eggs. And I guess from the period 1903 to the beginning of World War I, the Wiener Werkstatt in Vienna produced 925 postcard designs. And that was one of the things that interested Mr. Lauder, and he ended up collecting all of them. He collects Japanese postcards. This is a wonderful hand wood print of a view of Japanese countryside. This is from the 1921. Here, let me get the date of that. Oh, I lost my date. Oh, here it is. Oh, 1912, Tournament of the Far Eastern Athletes in Japan, in Tokyo. This is the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which was actually designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but that's not the reason why Mr. Lauder collected. It was because it was Japanese. He also collected woven in silk postcards, such as this wonderful example from the Titanic. I don't know if you're familiar with woven in silk postcards. I know many of you are, but many of you may not be. Gosh, it's kind of a long story, and I know I'm going on quite long, but this is a postcard that's actually like a little mat with a cut out, almost like a picture. You would mat a photograph or something. And then inside the mat is a piece of ribbon, figurative ribbon, with that design woven. The picture of the Titanic is woven into the ribbon. And this is an example of that kind of ribbon, which is woven on a jacquard loom. So you can see the front of it and the back of it. These are now referred to Stephengraphs or woven in silk postcards. And there were many of them printed for the ships that crossed the ocean, not only the views of the ships themselves, but also the flags of the two nations that the ships were going back and forth between. So in this particular example, between Sweden and the United States on the RMS Baltic. He collects women's right to vote movement and the suffragette movement. He collects Santas, interestingly. He's Jewish by background and ethnicity, but he collects Santas. And this particular one has a purple coat, which is distinctive. And he collects 1933-34 Chicago World's Fair Century of Progress postcards. So you can see what a wide variety, from Japan to Wiener Werkstatt to the Century of Progress. But the thing they have in common is that they're exciting aesthetically. They're artistic. There's an intrigue beyond the documentary. There's something more to the design of the card or the way it's produced. This particular one is for the Valdura Paint Company, and it's a beautiful set. There are several in the set, and they are serigraphs or silkscreen postcards. So those are some of the things that Mr. Lauder collects. And I will say, let me go back to that quickly and say, so Mr. Lauder still has some of his collection himself. He's given his Japanese collection to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which has an important Asian collection. And he gave part of his collection to the Curt Teich Postcard Archives before we gave it to the Newberry. And then he gave his Wiener Werkstatt collection to the Neue Gallery in New York City, the collecting scope of which is sort of German early 20th century art. So he has some of his collection still, but he is beginning to give it to specific locations to be in keeping with whatever the collecting scope is of that organization. The other thing I should say is that at a certain point after we had finished cataloging the Teich Company archives, we began to collect other postcards printed, and our collecting scope eventually became anything to do with postcards printed or produced by anyone for anywhere in the world. So they broadened to be anything that related to postcards or was a postcard. And we augmented the Teich Company archives in that way. and that's the collection that's today at the Newberry Library. So it is the Teich Industrial Collection, which is the nucleus of it. But we began many decades ago to collect postcards from any place, printed or produced by anyone. So that's why Leonard Lauder gave us part of his collection. And there are also some other collections within the Teich archives. There's the rich juvenile amusement park collection, two great examples of amusement parks from that collection. And there's the James R. Powell Route 66 collection. So Jim Powell collected or tried to collect or is still trying to collect all the postcards printed along the route of Route 66 from Chicago to Santa Monica Pier. I'll show you some really terrific examples, starting with this, which is a Curt Teich card of the map itself, the route, I should say. This great real photo postcard of Winslow, Arizona. This is one of my all-time favorite cards, and I can't exactly understand why, but there's something about, maybe it's because I am a baby boomer, there's something about this, the color of this and the neon and maybe the cars that just speak to me of all those summers that I spent on vacation with my family on the road. And this one, that's Route 66 out in front there. I just want to say. I think this is the quintessential Route 66 postcard to me, because there it is, sand on either side, or dust or sand on either side. And I love the description of all the amenities to be found here, you know, from the coffee shop to the refined cocktail bar, not just a cocktail bar, but refined, mind you. An organist, Fred Laskowski, he's going to play for you at your request. There's arts and crafts. You can eat. There's curios, and it's all here on Route 66. But I just love the way it sort of crops up out of nowhere on the road. And then after you've partaken of all the wonders of this place, then you can get back out on the road and keep going east or west. Okay, so we're almost done, in case you're worried. I mentioned a couple of times that the part of what Curt Teich kept was not only an example of every card that the company printed, but he also kept the original art files, the production files that went into transforming a black and white photograph into a finished postcard. This is one of my favorite examples. It's from 1953 of Kirk's Better Foods in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And it's like a quintessential coffee shop. Looks like a nice place. And this, what you're looking at here, is the finished postcard. And this is the black and white photograph that is in the art file still today, that was sent to the plant in Chicago to be transformed into a color postcard. And so if you look at the details, you've got a bus cart right in the forefront there. There's a rag that's fallen on the ground behind the counter. You know, there's lots of people, not only diners, but some people coming in and out. And then on the wall there, you see on the right-hand side that if we go back to that postcard, there's wallpaper on the wall, but in the actual photograph, there isn't. And so on the back of this, we have all of the indications and directions that were written probably by the salesman in Sioux Falls, who's, you know, in Sioux Falls drumming up business, as to what needs to be changed. So the print instructions. And so they say, you know, dark green ceiling, the top walls are light green, the seats are this color and that color. And look at that last indication there, remove farmer at door. And sure enough, there was a farmer there, but when the art department gets a hold of that photograph and they retouch him and all of his farmer friends right out of the scene, I think that's so funny, because in Sioux Falls in 1953, farmers have got to be a pretty big part of your business. There's, you know, that's all there is around Sioux Falls is it's farming country. But this is the retouched photograph. So you see that they've added Kirk's Cafe, that's actually hand drawn by the art department, and then cropped the bus tray out, and they've cropped the photograph so you don't see the cloth on the floor, and they've added the wallpaper, because indeed in the art files is a piece of that original wallpaper. So if you think about what the printers in Chicago needed to get the color right, and if the client could just slip in a little piece of whatever, linoleum, naugahyde, carpet, wallpaper, whatever is important, if you just slip a little piece of it into the art file or send it to Chicago, then the printer can get that color right. There are 126,000 of these art files in that collection that remained in the company factory when they closed down operations. So this is just one of those. So almost in conclusion, I'm just going to quickly go through some of these really fabulous California postcards. I just took them offline so that I could augment what I was showing you today. Wonderful large letter postcard of California. There's a equally charming San Jose large letter. From a little earlier time period, the Greetings from San Francisco, that's a bit of a version of that original Gruß aus Heidelberg card that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, but a little more saturated. Obviously, you don't have to accommodate for that message on the front because this is after 1907. So you can fully use that front for the design, but the impact and the raison d'etre is the same. And I put this one in because it's very much like that Gruß aus Heidelberg card. It's an early view, a 1905 view of Stanford University in Palo Alto. And I just put it in because of the California connection. One of my favorites from your part of the world. I'm sure you guys have all seen all these if you collect California cards, but I mean, this is really a charming card, and it's a little unusual. It sort of blends map with illustration in quite a charming way. And this one, because it's the exact same thing. It is the exact same thing. If we think about that, the Eiffel Tower examples that I showed from 1907 and then 1999, these are the same. The intention is the same. The aesthetic is just different. And the place has changed. So a wonderful Panama Pacific exhibition postcard. I've always loved this postcard. So I thought I'd add it tonight. A real photo postcard of the California coast, probably on Highway 1. A 1940 Santa Fe Railroad card. The new high school in San Jose. My niece my sister and her family live in San Jose, and my niece just graduated from one of the high schools there in San Jose. And I sent her, it was her birthday yesterday, and I sent her a picture of this. She just graduated from high school. It's not the same high school, but kind of the same thing. Wonderful view of Market Street. Now, here's a good example. If this were a printed card, those streetcar lines and the overhead electrical lines would all have been taken out. It's just a great travel lodge, San Jose on Alameda Boulevard. And this one is a little bit later, wouldn't you say, maybe 1970, 70 or 71? Postcards were still being printed in those years. Not as many, but not none. Somewhere in between. Not everything it was saturated by that time period, but we have a lot of, as malls came onto the scene, these indoor malls, there are a lot of postcards of the interiors of these malls in this time period. And just a couple of other California locations that I found charming, so I took them to show you tonight. That's just such a beautiful card, isn't it? Something about the color. And this is the earthquake in San Jose. This is from a series of these. And of course, Disneyland. And so in conclusion, I offer you this beautiful girl because I didn't, in my presentation, even to a general audience, I don't even touch on this type of postcard that were during the golden age of postcards, especially, were printed and hand touched, hand retouched rather, by the millions probably. Just the charming world of postcards that involves not documentary, the documentation of everyday life and the commonest everyday life, in many cases troublesome, I mean, not troublesome, but yeah, troubling everyday life, but also the utter charm of whimsy and fantasy and art, just for the sake of whimsy and fantasy and art, all appeared on postcards too. And such as this one, which we would, refer to today as a novelty card, just like those feathers are actually real feathers. It was actually sent through the mail. It's like a postcard from Salt Lake City that would have a little bag of salt attached to it, and it got sent through the mail. Or a potato, for those of you who are with us at the very beginning, a potato postcard. My last two postcards this evening were sent in 1907. This first one was sent by Pablo Picasso to his dear friend Guillaume Apollinaire in 1907. So think about that, because I send postcards, you send postcards, my son sent a postcard from the Black Hills, and everyone sends them. And Picasso in 1907 was not a famous person. This is a perfect realization of everything that Picasso is. It's an exuberance of art. It's a use of the postcard medium to send this sort of just artful expression to his great friend. And then this one, which was sent 11 years later in 1918, also to Guillaume Apollinaire. And obviously the importance of these two postcards is significant because of the change in Picasso's own style. But he still wasn't particularly famous by 1918. He was getting there, but not particularly famous. So he's just an average guy sending postcards like we all do. But today, I mean, they're amazing to us. So all of this has now gone to the Newberry Library. And especially with this group tonight, I could not be more pleased to say that we transferred it to them in October of 2016. And in 2018, the Newberry Library named postcards as their 11th core collection. Right along with early modern literature and cartography and genealogy and all the other core collections of the Newberry Library. This is an important private research library, one of the most important in the world. And because Curt Teich thought to do what he did, and because it came into public hands, and professional archival and museum professionals were employed to organize it and make it available to the public, and then to have that larger idea of augmenting it into something special. Now it's in a place where it can be available to serious researchers from all over the world and will be supported from here on out. So it had gotten almost too big for our agency to handle. It's a little bit like the tail wagging the dog, and we needed to get it to a place that was more in keeping with its importance. But that is a very big deal, postcard friends, that postcards were named the 11th core collection of the Newberry Library. The Newberry is a private library, but it's free and open to the public. I show you just the opening web page of the Curt Teich Postcard Archives collection. You can go on there and you see a lot of the details. Those are all links, like Dexter Press, Detroit Publishing Company, the John High Collection, the Leonard A. Lauder Tuck Collection. So you can click on any of those, and a lot of that material is digitized. You can use the collection. And if you're ever visiting Chicago, the Newberry has wonderful exhibitions. They're free and open to the public. You can come and research at the library. You just have to apply for a reader's card, which you do right there when you walk in the door. And it's just a hidden jewel. A lot of people come to Chicago and they never visit the Newberry, and they should. So that's where it is today. That's an overview of it. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. I know I spoke a long, long time, and I know because of you all are such experts yourself that I was telling you a lot of information that you already knew. So I appreciate your attention and your staying with it. And I'm done talking. If you have any questions, we can be happy to stay on and talk as long as anyone wants to.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Katherine.
Catherine, this is Felix Rodriguez. I've often wondered why postcards as a photographic specimen are not really pleasing. And I just found out from you that most of them were taken by salesmen. So, but nonetheless, they have this sense of immediacy. And as you said, everydayness that is, that is unequaled. So they may not be taken by professional photographers, but that sense of immediacy that I could see in many images is worth something. So were these salesmen trained at all to take photographs, or they just carried a camera and then went around and take anything that they fancy, or how did it go?
Well, those comments are only specific to the Teich company.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Nonetheless, though, yeah.
Yeah, nonetheless, I think your point, I understand what you're saying. And for the Teich company itself, the salesmen were equipped with cameras, view cameras, and they were trained to take photographs, but not trained. And they were trained aesthetically in a sense, but from a postcard point of view. So, how to frame up, what to include, and how to frame. But they weren't artists by any means. They weren't photographers. They were salesmen who took photographs. So there is a difference there. In the late 50s, the Curt Teich company specifically hired its first photographer, who was a photographer, not a salesperson. And so, and there were other companies, the Detroit Publishing Company, for instance, published the photography of William Henry Jackson, famous photographer. So that's only the case. What I said about salesmen was only the case with the Teich company and probably other large printing companies. But I was speaking specifically there. But I understand what you're saying about how they aren't pleasing. They're interesting, but often they're not pleasing in the way that that a photograph that's made as a photograph, as opposed to a certain size of photograph for a different purpose, might be. I think that would be actually an interesting question to explore, and especially the way you articulate it as with the term pleasing. I think that that's a very apt observation that you've made there, and would be interesting to explore more. I don't know that we can do it at great length tonight, but
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I'm so impressed.
Can you hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
I'm sure there's a few others postcard collectors, but I collect Nevada in all versions of a particular postcard. And a lot of times the only thing that changes on the postcard are the clouds. Can you tell us any more about why the cloud, why whether there's a new printing or new order, they just change the clouds? Is there any history behind that?
Are you just talking about Teich postcards or any postcards?
Specifically Curt Teich. I mean, I've got a
with Curt Teich.
And so, for example, a railroad depot in Caliente, Nevada, they would be sold on the trains many times, but you can see that over maybe a period of 10 years, the same depot, same photograph, but the clouds have changed. I'm wondering whether there was any philosophy behind that.
I would posit, because I don't know, but I would posit that it was a way to change up the picture as a form of a product.
Okay.
That on the postcard rack, it might, the same client, so let's say it's a five and dime, drugstore, maybe that's the client in wherever. And they ordered 5,000 of them 3 years ago, and they just need, I think it's a form of freshening up the stock. There was certainly no reason on the Teich company side why they would change that image, because they were famous, actually. Curt Teich himself was famous for really selling the first printing at a very inexpensive price point and then making money on reprints. So there would be no reason from the Teich company point of view to encourage a customer to change that up, because they would have to, on the Chicago end, they would have to do something in the print process to change the clouds.
One last question. In the printing process, could that change? Because sometimes the cloud simply has moved left to right. Is there something in the printing process that could cause that?
No, they'd specifically have to do that. They'd have to, someone in the art department or in the photo, if it's not in retouching, they might change, they could change, if that's a separate film, which it might be, they could actually move it a little bit, that film, and then, I can see them doing that. They could move a whole register of clouds over. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
They could have done that.
Okay, thank you.
Why they would do that intentionally to really make it different, it would have been on the part of the client, not on the part of the printer.
One thing I can say, maybe, Robert, I don't know this to be a fact, but I saw something where people would take images and they would go from daylight to nighttime scenes. And the nighttime scenes, they would use a darker paper to print the postcard on, and they would usually add clouds and the moon, and it would make it a nighttime scene of exactly the same image that you saw during the day. So I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, but I've seen that myself.
No, they never quite worked to make the cloud or the sky black and with the daylight. But they're interesting efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, Sjpc, are you there?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Sjpc, that was pretty typically done in the early 1900s of changing the pictures just to create better sales. And example is that was Edward H. Mitchell. He would put out a postcard in one year, and the next year he would just add some flags, or he'd change the clouds. You have it. And that was just for sales purposes.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yes,
nice
sir.
to be here.
Thanks, Walt.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I know. I saw you. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else?
I have one question just about the Newberry Library collection in Chicago. As far as visiting it, what exactly are you able to see? I mean, if you're interested in a certain geographic area or something, are they able to bring out cards of that area, or are they able to show you the artwork that went behind it? Or I'm just curious.
I'm sure they're able to do that. I mean, that's the point of having it available, obviously, is to make it available. I guess I would, even when we were managing it before we gave it to the Newberry, what we required is if you wanted to come and visit, we actually had a full exhibition, a permanent exhibition on the history and significance of postcards. I saw someone who was with us this evening and actually visited our museum and saw that. some years ago. The Newberry Library does not have an exhibition on the history and significance of postcards. Rather, they attempt to use that collection in exhibitions as much as possible. But coming to the Newberry, and oh, I know what I was going to say. So even if you came to us when we were working with the collection, we would just want you to tell us what it is you want to see, and so we'd have some time to assemble it. The Teich company collection was not in any kind of order except number order. So the only way that you could, let's say you wanted to see all of the Oriental Revival bandstands in 7 East Coast states. Well, we could do that. We would just put in a Boolean search for, the towns or the states, and Oriental Revival as an aesthetic, and bandstands, and it would give us, the 15 cards that you wanted to see. And we would have to go physically and get each one of those, because the way it's organized is by numbers as they were printed. So it's not like, here's all of Iowa, here's all of Connecticut, here's all of California. So to pull out a specific group of cards was very labor intensive for the staff. So it got to a point where we just had to, we just wanted to understand, you wanted the visitor to understand how labor intensive that is. What you're asking us to do is to spend hours of time pulling all this stuff and getting it together. And then, so really, I imagine the Newberry works in a similar way, like what is it you would like to see, and tell us a little bit about your research. But that's why they're there. It's a library. They're there to provide access to the materials in their care. So I imagine you would just have to say, hey, I'm coming. I'd like to apply for a reader card, and I'd like to see all the Oriental Revival bandstands in these 5 East Coast states, whatever it is you want to see. But I encourage everyone this evening to just go onto the Newberry Library website. You just go to core collections, postcards, and then you'll find all kinds of instructions, how to use the collection, send us an inquiry. You'll find all the instructions and directions that you'll need on their website.
Thank you.
One thing, I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I'm just curious, the Picasso postcards that you showed, are those in the Newberry collection or elsewhere?
No, those are elsewhere. I don't know where they are now. They were in a private collection when they're not in the Newberry collection. No.
But interestingly,
I think in fact, Susan, those are the only cards that I showed, except for all the California cards. I just threw those in, that I found them online.
I was fascinated to see it, because there was one Picasso card that came up maybe 2 years ago at auction. And apparently he was sending this friend postcards on a regular basis. If we can identify 3 cards, there might well have been more of them. And just an interesting fact to put in my personal archive.
Yeah.
Also, I want to thank you for this presentation, but also several years ago, I had called to find out how many cards were produced of a certain image. I was looking for a card for a client and I couldn't find it. And when I heard it was something like 35,000 cards were produced, I'm trying to remember. I knew I was looking in the wrong place for the card. So every piece of information was used very appropriately. And I thank you again.
Yay.
Okay.
Katherine, I have a question, if I may. Sorry, Joe. I've seen your hand go up a lot. I'm Alan Peterson up in Washington State. I know how to identify the linen era Curt Teich. There's a CT, it just says C period, T period. Outside the linen area, are there any other secret ways, or they're all going to say Curt Teich, especially for the earlier cards?
Well, there are some series, that National Malleable Castings Company series of the segregated. Those are in what's called a C. we call them the C series, and they do not, none of them say Curt Teich on them. They don't say CT. You couldn't tell by the back that it was printed by Curt Teich. I have an image of the back, but I can't just share it with you. So there are certain series that unless you know that they're produced by Curt Teich, you wouldn't know that they're produced by Curt Teich. If you follow that kind of obscure way of saying it, I know, but that's because I came about it in this different way. But if you encountered it just at a show or something, you'd never know that it was printed by Curt Teich. So all of the numbering series, when we had the collection, we put together a dating guide to all of the series that Curt Teich ever produced. And we turned all of that good work over to the Newberry Library. I imagine it's available on their website. I don't know whether they've added digital pictures of the different series to that. They could have done. We didn't do it in our time, but every one of the series that Curt Teich ever printed, and there were many of them, some of them are easy, like the linen eras, those are easy. The linens and the chromes are easy because they're like that 1CH371. So once you understand it, you can identify it. And the chromes are the same way. That was, instead of CH, it's DK. Same.
Does the Newberry have scans of the back available online? I haven't looked yet.
Well, I tell you where, well, no, not for, I mean, there's like almost 1 million individual cards. Well, there's like 3.5 million physical cards in that collection. I don't think they've digitized the backs to many of them. However, not systematically, for sure. But yeah, then I kind of lost my train of thought there. What was I saying? I just lost my train of thought.
About the backs of cards.
Oh, about the backs. So we digitized several thousand Curt Teich images into the Illinois Digital Archives, which is available online for free. And in that case, we digitized the fronts and the backs, both. So that's one way you can look at the backs of several thousand Curt Teich cards, is going to the Illinois Digital Archives. So you can just, do a search for Illinois Digital Archives. And then if you wanted to, you could put in Curt Teich Postcards, and it would probably bring up everything, and there'd be the fronts and the backs digitized. What the Newberry, what the Newberry has done though with the collection since 2016, I'm not sure, because I'm not involved with it anymore on the day-to-day, so I don't know how much further they've carried that digitization.
That's great to know, though.
I can comment there that there's a Curt Teich checklist published in a hard copy, and you probably, I have one, but you probably could get it on the Amazon website, which gives you literally, I think, every Curt Teich that was ever printed as a checklist, if that helps anybody.
Who was the gentleman who was asking? Was that Alan? Were you you're the one who was asking me about the backs, right?
Yeah, in general, maybe to help identify them as a Curt Teich.
Yeah, because I do have if you want to send me your email or just email me, I can send you the back of that one series, the C series. That's the one that is really hard to identify. You just would never know it's a Teich card. So I do have a back. I could easily email you that one.
Okay, I noticed that
most of the Teich cards, though, you can identify.
The Punxsutawney card that you showed initially said Minsky Brothers on the front.
Minsky Brothers, that's the client, really the local distributor. Minsky Brothers was a souvenir distributor. And you wouldn't, that particular one, the Punxsutawney large letter, I think that has the number on the back of it, probably in the stamp box or below the dividing line. Sometimes they're on the front, sometimes they're on the back.
Kathy, one other quick question on years ago when you got the original collection, I called up and asked if I could get a Xerox copy of the logs of all the Nevada cards.
Oh,
And the person said, sure, no problem at all. And within a week, I got a thick envelope with all the logs, which are now, of course, available.
see how that works?
Well, one of the challenges with the logs, though, is they don't indicate, or there's some sort of magic code on the reprinting. Like there's either a check mark or a double check mark or a check mark with a hash line through it. Is there any secret code to know the reprinting?
Yeah, you know, we never cracked that code. I know exactly what you mean. It's like a check mark or a double check mark or a check mark with a line through the long part of the check.
Yeah.
And, I'm afraid we never cracked that code.
Okay. Thank you.
Java, just a quick comment from a stamp collector. A couple of us tonight are members of the local stamp club, and we're kind of more interested in the stamp side of the postcard than the picture side, but I really enjoyed the presentation. And all stamp collectors, you gather postcards along the way. So we all have some in our collections. And what I've heard frequently asked is, are any of them tuck cards? You didn't mention that name tonight. Is that anything special in terms of postcard collecting?
Tuck, T-U-C-K?
Yes.
Well, that's an English company. The Raphael Tuck is the full name of the company. Very important company. In fact, Mr. Lauder's collection that he gave to us was his Raphael Tuck collection. You can go, Tuck, it doesn't have anything to do with Teich. The one is English and Teich is German. I don't know what else to say about that. It's an important company though, because one of the things that Raphael Tuck intentionally did, very, very different from the Teich approach, was they intentionally produced postcards of paintings, if you will, not like reproductions of famous paintings, but paintings as postcards. And their reason for doing that was to provide an aesthetic to the average everyday person. It's an interesting history and completely different from the Teich history. I see that in the chat to everyone, Alan has put in, there's a good reference website for a list of Tuck postcards. If you go online and just put in, do a little searching around for Raphael Tuck and Sons, it's an interesting history and just completely different from almost everything I've said here. And it's interesting you bring that up because, you know, right at the conclusion of my remarks, I show that whimsical little girl with the bubbles and the ribbons and the toadstool and then the peacock. There's so much that I don't touch on when I give this. And I realize that what I do is lengthy. I realize that people really have to keep with it to, you know, yours was a little bit extra long because I added more content on the Teich side, but there's so much that I don't talk about. There's artist created postcards, there's mail art, there's, you know, the whole Raphael Tuck aesthetic. And
what I like is the history and the political aspects of postcards.
The political aspects, the comic cards. I don't even show a comic card in my whole presentation. That was certainly huge in the UK.
Leather postcards.
What?
Leather postcards.
Leather, yeah, the novelty postcards. The leather postcards are, and their whole history associated with World War I. And so there's just, it's like anything you touch on, but I'm kind of like I don't collect postcards myself. I'm just like a cheerleader for how on postcards, these little 3.5 by 5.5 slips of nothing is everything in the 20th century at some level, the good and the bad, the whimsical and the troubling, and everything in between. And I think it's an important communication device, an important documentary device, and I know that you guys, again, I'm talking to the choir, but yes, Alan is now saying he's talking in the chat about oilettes. So yes, you're right. Tuck produced many, many different types of cards, not just the ones I described, but the oilettes are those little paintings as postcards that they did for aesthetic purposes. Just go and read a little bit about the history of the Tuck company.
Will do, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to talk about clouds for a second. I think it's pretty obvious that no one likes a vacuum, especially the postcard producers. And most of those photographs taken outside will have a big sky behind them. And most of the time that sky is empty. And so they would fill it with an overlay of clouds. And if it was reprinted, maybe the original overlay couldn't be found and another overlay was used. But clouds, I think, were added simply to fill in the blank spaces on the card.
Well, for me, they also indicated how popular the card was. So if I've got the same view, 5 cards with different clouds, it indicates that was a pretty good seller. If it was reprinted that many times with a different cloud. So just for me, it's a way to determine whether this was a real popular seller for tourists or on trains or whatever. Just kind of a clue.
I see there's one other question about copyrights. Did they ever take legal action? I have cards of some same image published by Crop, Detroit, and Curt Teich. To my knowledge, the Curt Teich company never took any legal action. I don't think that was their interest. Curt Teich especially, and even Curt Teich Jr., they were both very protective of their processes. And they thought of some of their print processes as unusually high quality. They worried that their secrets would be stolen somehow. They were very protective about those, but to my knowledge, they weren't as protective of the images themselves. It's almost in a way that the printing came first and the image came second, in a sense. And that makes sense when you think about Teich's background. One thing I didn't talk about is how he came from a printing family in Lobenstein. They have a family crest dating back to the middle of the 18th century, so 1725 or 35 or something. And there's a kind of a German, almost like an Austrian eagle, and he's holding in his gripped talons tools of the printing trade. So for him, printing ran deep in his blood, and German printing ran deep in his blood. He went back to Germany a number of times as an adult to look into new technology, printing technology, to learn what was the hottest thing in printing technology, and then to apply that on the stateside to his own business. So I think that in general terms, he was closely guarded about the print processes, but not so much. I don't think he thought about the intellectual property as much. Now, I'm saying that a little bit, that's just a feeling that I get, and from a lot of reading about him and just living with the collection for so many years. But I think I don't know that there were any, that he took legal action over the images, but he was very protective about the processes. And as to this question of the same image published by numerous publishers, I just think that's maybe the image, maybe you as the client were the holder of the image somehow, and maybe you got a better deal. Like, I can see that as it was, they didn't think of, I don't think they thought of the interactions like we think of them today. It was just it's like you're getting a brochure printed, and if you get a better price here, then you might go there if it's the same quality, so your reprint might be printed by a publisher for some reason. little hard to
Right.
tell unless they were.
I noticed Patrick had his hand up, Catherine. Go
Okay.
ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a lot of questions on the clouds and so forth. I worked as a photographer for 25 years, and I didn't do postcards per se, but I did like everything else. Did I do a postcard? I don't know. But anyway, early film, usually the film, your skies would get blown out. We call it getting blown out. And so that's why you don't see the clouds generally, unless you're shooting on an April day, maybe in the morning or in the evening. And one of the things photographers are always looking for is even lighting. So especially in architectural photography, in the morning when the interior light is even with the exterior lights, you're looking for those kinds of things unless you bring in flash and so forth to even it up. And but a lot of these photographers that you're talking about, and you were saying, these fellows that come in with just usually probably a handheld photograph. They're going into a room, they're taking a couple of shots, and yeah, they're not pretty per se, but they're very important. They're documentary photographers. And yeah, there was something, usually you like to pick up something that's on the floor, but it'll get fixed in post-production. And so those things are not, it's not always ideal when you're shooting quickly. So you get it later and so forth. For a lot of those folks that are shooting something like that restaurant shot, and the outside door where that farmer was standing, that you're not going to see the car on the street because that's going to get blown out outside, because the exposure value outside is much brighter than the interior of that time that you shot, unless it was early morning when the sun's coming up, and of course no one's there in the restaurant at that time. So there's different reasons for why clouds aren't there at those particular times, and then when you put them in and so forth. And it's the time of year too, it's summer day. So everything when you're shooting is not always perfect. And so that's why there's that production folks, hey, make this a little more ideal. The farmer might have not been, because that farmer, I noticed him right away when I was looking at the original shot. And I was thinking, that's a big person blocking the door. And it's not because he's a farmer, it's just your eye went over to there. And so you want to take that out and make the restaurant more inviting. Oh, there's a beautiful light coming in, it's refreshing, instead of the big farmer who's gonna get you or something. I don't know, it's just those little weird things when you're looking at an image. So yeah. There you go.
Kathy, got to ask you one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Yep, go ahead, Robert.
Was there at Curt Teich, I look at the flag, the American flag, and often in the printing process, the stripes get moved all around. They don't seem to be in one place. And they seem to add flags when there were no flags. Was there any flag process or rule or procedure or policy at Curt Teich?
No, except to say that, yeah, they added flags. I don't know that. My guess is that the salesman encouraged it to a certain extent. Like you may want to add a flag, that would be nice, but they added a lot of flags where there weren't flags, for sure. You could probably go through all those 126,000 files and just see, by percentage, how many places actually had flags versus didn't have flags that were just added. In the postcard world, there's more flags than not. Than in real life, but there wasn't a standard about it, to my knowledge. It's just that they were kind of encouraged.
Well, I thought he was trying to be patriotic during the war, during the especially the linen period. It seemed to me that he was adding the flags, but I'm trying to add something into it more than just having a nice flag.
It's a form of patriotism. I do. I mean, if you think about, he's a first generation German immigrant, came here as an adult, and he, one of the things that maybe people don't know is that during the World War II, his production of postcards was sharply diminished because they printed almost all of the invasion maps for the US Army Map Service in Chicago, and many of the territorial maps as well. And it was this highly top secret endeavor. They just had those big printing presses and they were able to handle it. And I've always found that interesting. There's a first generation German immigrant who hadn't been in the country but a few decades and was asked to do something as sensitive as print all of the invasion maps for the US Army Map Service. But two of his sons served in the war, and one of them was killed in the war. He had 5 children, and 2 of his sons were in the service, and one was killed. And he referred to our boys in writing a couple of different places, to my knowledge, in the Teich family correspondence. And by our boys, he meant our servicemen, US servicemen. So he had that sort of hot patriotism of the new immigrant. And Teich wasn't involved in every job by any means, but I think that flags were part and parcel of that, I guess I would say. I would say they were not systemically encouraged, but they were encouraged. And again, that's just me reading into having a lot of experience with this material and this family and this man. So take it for what it's worth. Should we call it a day, folks?
I'm sure it's getting kind of late back there.
We
appreciate it very much.
Oh,
thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much. And it was just really a pleasure and an honor to be with you all and to see some faces that are so familiar, and just a lot of kisses from Libertyville, and thank you so much for sticking with it. And Shav, thank you for all your organization and your care and detail orientation to everything. It was terrific.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
All right.
Good night.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night, Felix.
Bye-bye, Catherine.